Hannah adjusted the phone against her shoulder, her voice low and measured as she spoke to yet another creditor. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, blending into the hum of the boutique law firm's steady rhythm. She jotted down notes on a yellow pad, her penmanship neat and methodical. "I understand," she said, exhaling softly. "I'll make the payment by the end of the month." "Thank you." Hanging up, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the family photo pinned discreetly beside her computer monitor. Ethan's gap-toothed smile beamed back at her, a reminder of her purpose and her greatest worry all at once. The receptionist desk had become a strange kind of refuge since her life imploded 2 years ago. A turbulent divorce had stripped her of the high-powered career she once held as a corporate strategist. Trading boardrooms for break rooms, she now pieced together a living through a patchwork of modest jobs, all centered around ensuring Ethan had what he needed. At 7 years old, he was precocious and inquisitive, with an imagination that could light up the darkest days. Hannah often felt she was living for two, every decision weighed by how it would affect the little boy who depended on her. The work at the boutique law firm was one of 3 jobs Hannah held, each one necessary to scrape by. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, she worked nights at a local diner, taking orders with a smile she hoped hid her exhaustion. Weekends were spent stocking shelves at a supermarket just outside her neighborhood. None of it was glamorous, but it paid the bills, barely. Each week was a juggling act of schedules, transportation, and childcare, leaving little room for anything else. Today had been no different. As the office ebbed and flowed with clients and staff, she kept her composure despite the stress gnawing at her edges. It was during this routine dance of pleasantries and paperwork that Mr. Grayson first noticed her. Tall and impeccably dressed, he carried an air of authority that turned heads without effort. He had come to discuss estate matters with one of the firm's partners but found his attention drifting toward the woman behind the front desk. He hadn't intended to linger, but something about her demeanor caught him off guard. Her words on the phone, though carefully chosen, betrayed a quiet desperation. Yet, there was no self-pity in her tone, no crack in her professionalism. She wore her struggles lightly, like a scarf pulled tightly against the cold. The following day, Grayson observed her again. This time, he watched as she guided a lost client to the right office, her smile warm and genuine despite the tension he suspected simmered just beneath the surface. There was a strength in her that intrigued him, though he didn't quite understand why it mattered. By the third encounter, curiosity had turned into a quiet resolve. Grayson approached the firm's partner with a few casual questions about their receptionist. The answers confirmed much of what he had guessed. Hannah was sharp, reliable, and fiercely private. As he listened, an idea began to take shape, one that aligned with a problem he was tasked with solving. It was too soon to act, but he filed the thought away for later. For Hannah, these moments went unnoticed. Her focus remained on the clock, calculating the hours until she could pick up Ethan from after-school care. She checked her account balance on her phone during her lunch break, her stomach sinking at the numbers staring back at her. Debt loomed over her like a thundercloud, but she pushed the anxiety aside. Tonight, she'd read Ethan his favorite bedtime story and remind herself that the fight was worth it. At home, things weren't much easier. Their apartment was small, with peeling wallpaper and a persistent draft no amount of weatherproofing could fix. The heating bills were a constant concern, and the neighbors were loud enough that Hannah often used white noise to help Ethan sleep. But she had made the space theirs, decorating it with thrift store finds and Ethan's colorful drawings. It wasn't much, but it was home. That evening, as Ethan built a fort out of couch cushions and an old blanket, Hannah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop. She scoured job boards, her eyes scanning countless listings that either required qualifications she didn't have or offered pay that wouldn't cover the rent. She rubbed her temples, the weight of the day catching up with her. When Ethan's laughter broke through her frustration, she smiled despite herself. He was her anchor, her reason to keep going no matter how tough things got. Hannah's fall from grace had been as swift as it was devastating. Just a few years ago, she had been a rising star in the corporate world, her name circulating in industry circles as a sharp strategist with a gift for turning floundering companies around. She had been proud of her accomplishments, balancing her professional ambitions with her role as a devoted mother to Ethan. But the cracks in her life had started to show when her marriage began to unravel. What started as subtle disagreements over priorities spiraled into irreconcilable differences, leaving her grappling with the emotional and financial fallout of a bitter divorce. The settlement had drained her savings, and with no family to lean on, she found herself rebuilding from scratch. The high-stakes career she had worked so hard to cultivate had become a casualty of the divorce as well. Late nights at the office and frequent business trips had been a sticking point in her marriage, and now, they weren't an option at all. Ethan needed her. The corporate ladder she once climbed with ease now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the grind of hourly wages and constant worry. Her days were an intricate ballet of logistics, each step carefully choreographed to ensure nothing fell through the cracks. Mornings began at the crack of dawn, packing lunches and ensuring Ethan was ready for school before she raced to her receptionist job. Lunchtime was a whirlwind of errands, often spent standing in line at the post office or picking up groceries on a tight budget. Afternoons were filled with a steady stream of phone calls, client greetings, and paperwork at the law firm, followed by a mad dash to pick up Ethan before heading to her second job. Evenings were a blur of cooking, cleaning, and squeezing in time to help Ethan with his homework. She rarely ate dinner while sitting down, opting instead to finish chores or prepare for the next day while Ethan chattered away about school or his latest obsession with dinosaurs. By the time she collapsed into bed, her mind was too restless to let her sleep. She often lay awake, staring at the ceiling, calculating how much she could stretch her next paycheck and praying nothing unexpected, like a car repair or a medical bill, would upend her delicate balance. Despite the unrelenting challenges, Hannah refused to let her son see her falter. She took pride in small victories, managing to pay the electric bill on time, finding a second-hand coat for Ethan before winter, or making his favorite pancakes on Saturday mornings. To him, she was unshakable, a constant source of love and support in a world that could be unpredictable and unfair. But when the apartment was quiet and Ethan was fast asleep, the weight of it all pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. She'd sit by the window with a cup of tea she couldn't always afford, watching the city lights and wondering how much longer she could keep going. Henry Carter leaned back in his chair, the sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office casting long shadows across the mahogany desk. The view from his penthouse was breathtaking, endless cityscape glittering with ambition and power. But today, it felt like a gilded cage. The weight of his father's stipulation pressed down on him like a physical force. Henry stared at the will in front of him, the words blurring together as frustration simmered just beneath his carefully composed exterior. The document bore his late father's signature, its stipulations so audacious they bordered on farcical. Marry within a year, stay married for at least another, and the full inheritance would be his. Fail, and the empire his father had spent decades building would unravel, leaving Henry with nothing but debts and unfinished legacies. It was, in Henry's words, an outrageous interference from beyond the grave. The absurdity of it all gnawed at him. Henry was a pragmatic man, someone who thrived on control and order. The idea of tying his financial stability, and his future, to a personal relationship felt like a cruel joke. His father, ever the traditionalist, had built his wealth on the principles of loyalty and family. But Henry had spent his adult life avoiding the entanglements his father revered, choosing instead to focus on growing the empire into a global powerhouse. Now, with his father gone, the cracks in the foundation were becoming apparent. Revenue streams that once seemed invincible had dried up, key partnerships were teetering, and competitors smelled blood in the water. The inheritance wasn't just a cushion, it was a lifeline, the only thing standing between the company's survival and total collapse. His frustration boiled over as he paced the room, loosening his tie and muttering under his breath. Henry pinched the bridge of his nose, his frustration evident as he turned to the man seated across from him. Grayson, his trusted confidant and the executor of the estate, regarded him with calm detachment. "It's a simple solution," Grayson said, his tone measured. "Marry someone, fulfill the terms, and secure the inheritance. It's not ideal, but it's necessary." Henry scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "And invite the media to scrutinize every aspect of my life? The tabloids would have a field day." "No, Grayson. This needs to be handled discreetly. I won't have my personal life turned into a circus." Grayson inclined his head slightly, understanding the weight of the request. Henry's name was already a magnet for attention, his every move dissected by analysts and journalists alike. A high-profile marriage would only amplify the chaos. "Then we need someone invisible," Grayson replied. "Someone who won't attract attention or complicate matters." Henry's gaze sharpened. "Invisible?" Grayson hesitated, then nodded. "A candidate who meets the terms of the will but doesn't come with strings attached. Someone practical, grounded, and with no interest in public attention. They need the arrangement as much as you do. And we draft a contract that guarantees they are out of your life forever as soon as the terms are concluded." The room fell silent as Henry considered the suggestion. His instincts screamed against the idea of outsourcing something as personal as marriage, but the alternative, watching his empire crumble, wasn't an option. "Find someone," he said finally, his voice low. "And make sure they're perfect for this." Grayson left the meeting with a plan already forming in his mind. Over the next few days, he reviewed countless dossiers, each one detailing potential candidates who might fit Henry's requirements. But none of them felt right. They were either too connected, too ambitious, or too visible. He needed someone different, someone who could seamlessly fit into the background. His thoughts returned to the receptionist he'd noticed at the law firm. Hannah Hayes. There was something about her that stood out, despite her unassuming presence. She was poised under pressure, her professionalism unwavering even in moments of visible stress. Grayson had been impressed by her demeanor, but now he found himself wondering if she might be the answer to Henry's dilemma. He delved deeper, running a background check on her life. The results painted a picture of resilience and quiet determination. A single mother juggling multiple jobs, Hannah had given up a promising corporate career to raise her son after a contentious divorce. Her financial struggles were evident, mounting debts, no significant family support, but so was her strength. She had no ties that could complicate matters and every reason to consider the proposition. Grayson presented his findings to Henry with his usual efficiency. "She's ideal," he said, sliding a file across the desk. "Smart, discreet, and motivated. Her circumstances make the arrangement mutually beneficial." Henry flipped through the dossier, his expression impassive. The photo clipped to the front showed a woman with warm eyes and a determined set to her jaw. She wasn't the type he'd typically notice, but there was something compelling about her. "She has a child," he remarked, his tone neutral. An added layer of complexity, Grayson admitted, but not a deal-breaker. If anything, it might make her more inclined to accept. The offer would secure her son's future as well as her own. Henry leaned back, his fingers steepled as he considered the proposition. The logic was sound, but a part of him bristled at the notion of arranging his life so clinically. Still, time was running out, and the stakes were too high to ignore. "Approach her," he said finally. "Let's see if she's as perfect as you claim." Grayson nodded, his expression calm but focused. As he left the office, he couldn't shake a sense of unease. Hannah Hayes might fit the profile, but there was no way to predict how she would react to the proposal, or how her presence might change the carefully calculated dynamics of Henry's world. For now, all he could do was set the plan in motion and hope it wouldn't unravel before it began. Hannah fidgeted nervously as she smoothed the front of her blouse for what felt like the 10th time. The message from Mr. Grayson had been unexpected, an invitation to discuss a potential opportunity in his private office. She had no idea why someone of his stature would reach out to her, but the promise of a lucrative offer was too tempting to ignore. She needed a job, desperately, and this felt like a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak routine. The office building was sleek and modern, the kind of place she once frequented when her life looked vastly different. As the elevator carried her to the top floor, she couldn't help but feel out of place. Her second-hand blazer and sensible flats stood in stark contrast to the polished marble floors and expensive artwork that adorned the hallways. Grayson greeted her with a warm but professional smile, gesturing for her to sit in the plush leather chair across from his desk. His office was expansive, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city skyline. Hannah felt a pang of envy but pushed it aside. This wasn't about her feelings, it was about an opportunity she couldn't afford to pass up. "Thank you for coming, Miss Hayes," Grayson began, his tone calm and measured. "I'll get straight to the point. I have a unique proposition for you, one that could change your life." Hannah leaned forward, her nerves mingling with cautious excitement. "What kind of proposition?" she asked, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Grayson studied her for a moment before responding. "It involves an arrangement with my client, Mr. Henry Carter. Specifically, a marriage arrangement." For a moment, Hannah thought she'd misheard him. She blinked, her mind scrambling to process the words. "I'm sorry, did you say marriage?" "Yes," Grayson replied evenly. "It's a contractual agreement designed to meet specific requirements outlined in Mr. Carter's late father's will. The arrangement would be temporary, and the terms are straightforward. You will need to be married for 15 months, during which you and your son will reside in Mr. Carter's home. Of course, the deal will be strictly a facade and you will have separate living quarters and have no obligations to appear together in public." Hannah's heart raced as a mix of emotions surged through her: shock, anger, disbelief. "You want me to marry a stranger? For what? Money?" Grayson remained composed, unflinching under her scrutiny. "I understand this is unconventional, but I assure you it's a mutually beneficial arrangement. In exchange for your participation, all your debts would be erased and a trust fund would be established for your son. You would also receive a substantial payment at the end of the contract." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You think I'd sell myself for money? That I'd drag my son into some farce just to make ends meet?" "I think," Grayson said calmly, "that you're a pragmatic woman who understands what's at stake. This isn't about selling yourself, it's about securing a future for you and your son." His words struck a nerve, and Hannah clenched her fists, torn between fury and the painful truth. She wanted to storm out, to tell him exactly what she thought of his audacity. But then she thought of Ethan, of the mounting bills, the relentless calls from creditors, the nights she lay awake worrying about their future. The offer, as offensive as it felt, was also impossibly tempting. Grayson nodded, as if he'd expected her response. "Take your time. Think about it carefully. Think about your son. I'll arrange for a driver to take you home and we can meet again tomorrow, should you wish to discuss further." That night, Hannah couldn't sleep. The proposition replayed in her mind like a broken record. It felt wrong, almost absurd, but the logic was undeniable. Ethan's future could be secure, their struggles eased in ways she hadn't dared to imagine. She hated herself for even considering it, but the weight of her reality was too heavy to ignore. The next day, she returned to Grayson's office, her heart pounding with a mix of apprehension and reluctant determination. When Hannah arrived for the second meeting, the atmosphere felt notably different. This time, the office seemed quieter, the usual bustle of the reception area replaced with a tranquil hush. Grayson greeted her briefly before ushering her into an adjoining conference room where another man was waiting. He stood as she entered, his tailored suit impeccable, exuding a quiet authority. "Hannah Hayes, meet Henry Carter," Grayson said, gesturing toward him. "Miss Hayes," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming back. I hope the morning's been kind to you." Hannah hesitated before shaking it, her eyes searching his face. He was handsome in a polished, detached way, with an air of control that both intimidated and intrigued her. The room itself was a study in understated elegance, soft leather chairs, a gleaming mahogany table, and a discreet corner bar stocked with refreshments. Henry gestured to the chair opposite him, his movements fluid and deliberate. As she sat down, a server appeared, offering coffee, tea, and an array of pastries. "Please, help yourself," Henry said, his voice calm and inviting. "I know these discussions can be overwhelming." Hannah hesitated but accepted a cup of coffee, surprised by his attentiveness. He watched her with a steady gaze, his demeanor professional but disarmingly kind. Over the course of the meeting, he outlined the details of the arrangement with precision, addressing her concerns directly. He assured her that Ethan's future would be secure, emphasizing the trust fund and financial independence the arrangement would bring. "Your safety and well-being are paramount," he added, leaning forward slightly. "I'll ensure you're supported every step of the way. This isn't just about fulfilling a contract, it's about creating stability for both of us." Though all business in his explanations, Henry's gestures softened the tone of the meeting. He offered her more coffee when her cup ran low, asked if she was comfortable, and made subtle efforts to put her at ease. By the end of the discussion, Hannah found herself reassured by his calm confidence. Despite herself, she could see the benefits of the arrangement clearly, and while her reservations lingered, they felt less insurmountable. Hannah sat on the edge of Ethan's bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She watched as he carefully arranged his stuffed animals in a neat row, his brow furrowed in concentration. She had rehearsed the conversation a dozen times in her head, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt heavy and uncertain. "Ethan," she began softly, "there's something I need to talk to you about." He looked up, his eyes bright with curiosity. "What is it, Mom?" She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "We're going to be moving soon. I've accepted a new job, and it comes with a house. A big house. I think you'll like it." Ethan's face lit up with excitement. "A big house? Like in the movies?" "Something like that," she said, forcing a smile. "It'll be different, but it's a good opportunity for us." "Will the new house have a yard? Or maybe a pool?" he asked eagerly, his imagination already running wild. "It might," she replied, deflecting slightly. She hesitated, then added, "There will be someone else living there too. A nice man. But this is just about my work, okay? He's not going to be your new dad or anything like that." Ethan tilted his head, studying her closely. "Is he nice?" Hannah smiled genuinely this time, touched by her son's innocence. "Yes, he is." Satisfied, Ethan returned to his stuffed animals, and Hannah breathed a quiet sigh of relief. She had told him as much as she could without delving into the complexities of the arrangement. For now, it was enough. The wedding was conducted with little fanfare, just as Henry had requested. A justice of the peace officiated the ceremony in the drawing room of his mansion, with Grayson and a staff member serving as witnesses. Hannah wore a simple dress she had found at a thrift store, and Henry's tailored suit spoke more of business than celebration. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, there was no kiss, no embrace, just a quiet acknowledgement of their new roles. Hannah felt a strange mix of relief and sadness as she signed her name on the certificate, the weight of the moment sinking in. Henry, ever composed, thanked her softly before excusing himself to attend to business matters. Moving into the mansion was an experience that bordered on surreal. Ethan's excitement was palpable as they walked through the grand foyer, his eyes wide as he took in the ornate chandeliers and polished marble floors. The staff had been instructed to cater to their needs, and a young housekeeper eagerly showed Ethan to his new playroom, a space filled with toys, books, and art supplies that Hannah had negotiated into the contract. Watching her son's joy brought a lump to her throat. For the first time in years, she felt like she could give him something more than just the bare essentials. It was a small victory, but one that gave her a glimmer of hope. For Hannah, however, the adjustment was far more difficult. The mansion, though breathtaking, felt cold and impersonal. Every room was curated to perfection, from the spotless dining hall to the expansive library, but it lacked the warmth of a true home. She spent her first nights wandering the halls after Ethan had gone to bed, feeling like an intruder in someone else's life. Her interactions with Henry were polite but distant. They shared meals in near silence, exchanging only the necessary pleasantries. He seemed content to keep her at arm's length, and she was too overwhelmed by her new surroundings to push for more. Instead, she focused on helping Ethan settle into his new school and ensuring he felt secure in their new environment. Ethan, for his part, adapted quickly. He marveled at the expansive backyard, begged to explore the hidden corners of the house, and chattered endlessly about his new classmates. Watching him thrive brought Hannah a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. One evening, as she tucked Ethan into bed, he looked up at her with a question that caught her off guard. "Mom, are you happy here?" The honesty of his gaze made her pause. "I'm happy that you're happy," she replied carefully. "But you don't like it," he said, his childlike intuition cutting through her facade. "It's different," she admitted, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "But different isn't always bad. We just have to get used to it." Ethan nodded, his trust in her unwavering. "Okay. I'll help you get used to it, Mom." Tears pricked the corners of her eyes as she kissed his cheek. "You already do, sweetheart." In the weeks that followed, Hannah found herself carving out a routine. Mornings were spent helping Ethan get ready for school, afternoons were devoted to exploring her role as Henry's wife, and evenings were filled with quiet reflection. The staff treated her with a mix of deference and curiosity, unsure of how to interact with the woman who seemed both part of the household and separate from it. As much as she tried to focus on the positives, the strain of her new life began to take its toll. The mansion's grandeur only served to highlight the emptiness she felt, and her interactions with Henry remained frustratingly superficial. She often wondered if he regretted the arrangement or if he even thought about her at all outside their shared obligations. One evening, as she wandered through the sprawling gardens, she paused to watch the city lights twinkling in the distance. She thought about the life she had left behind, the sacrifices she had made, and the uncertainties that lay ahead. But then she thought of Ethan, his laughter filling the halls of the mansion, and reminded herself why she was here. She could endure the coldness, the isolation, and the uncertainty, for him. For his future. And for the hope that, one day, this new reality might feel like home. The soft murmur of voices drifted through the grand hallway, pulling Hannah from her thoughts. She had just finished cleaning up after dinner, a habit she clung to despite the staff's protests. It grounded her in a life that often felt like it wasn't her own. But now, curiosity got the better of her. The voices, one calm and measured, the other tinged with frustration, were coming from Henry's study. She approached quietly, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpeting. The door was ajar, and though she knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, something in the tension of their tones stopped her from walking away. "The numbers don't lie, Henry," Grayson was saying, his voice low but firm. "Without the inheritance, we're barely holding it together. Your father's empire is a house of cards, and the wind is picking up." Henry's reply was sharper, tinged with irritation. "I'm aware of the situation, Grayson. I don't need a lecture." "You might not need a lecture," Grayson countered, "but you need a plan." Hannah's heart sank as she realized what they were talking about. She stepped back, guilt and unease swirling in her chest. She hadn't asked for this arrangement, but now that she had agreed, she felt like the ground was shaking under her and she was insecure again. She retreated to the dining room, her thoughts racing. For weeks, she had lived in a bubble of polite detachment, focusing on Ethan and ignoring the cracks in the facade around her. But now, the weight of Henry's predicament was impossible to ignore. When Henry entered the room a few minutes later, his expression was calm, but she could see the tension in his eyes. He poured himself a glass of water and glanced at her. "You're still up?" Hannah hesitated, then set her glass down with more force than she intended. "I overheard part of your conversation," she admitted, her voice steady but tinged with defiance. "If I'm going to be tied to this situation, I think I deserve to know the truth." Henry stiffened, his gaze narrowing. For a moment, she thought he might deflect, but then he sighed and leaned against the counter. "The company is in trouble," he said simply. "My father left me a mess disguised as an empire. The inheritance was supposed to stabilize things, but it came with strings attached. Hence, this arrangement." Hannah crossed her arms, her unease giving way to frustration. "And you didn't think I should know about this? You brought me into your life, into your home, but you left me in the dark." "It wasn't relevant to the arrangement," Henry replied, his tone defensive. "It's relevant now," she shot back. "Because if this fails, it's not just you who suffers. Ethan and I are tied to this too." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Henry looked genuinely contrite. "You're right," he admitted. "I should have told you. But what would you have done differently?" Hannah thought for a moment, then drew on the instincts that had once made her a rising star in the corporate world. "For starters, I would have asked to see your numbers. I might not be part of your business, but I know enough to see patterns and solutions you might be missing." Henry raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued despite himself. "And what would you suggest?" She took a deep breath, her mind racing as she pieced together what little she knew. "Your father built his empire on loyalty and tradition, right? But times have changed. You need to diversify, focus on innovation, and streamline operations. Start with the ventures that are bleeding money, they're dragging the rest of the company down." Henry's lips quirked into a faint smile, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him in days. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," she replied, matching his smile. "But nothing worth saving ever is." Their conversation continued late into the evening, the tension between them easing as they delved deeper into the challenges facing the company. For the first time, Henry saw Hannah not just as a participant in a contractual arrangement, but as someone with the intelligence and resilience to be an asset. For Hannah, the shift was equally surprising. She had spent so long burying the skills that once defined her, focusing instead on survival. But now, she felt a spark of the person she used to be, a woman capable of solving problems, navigating challenges, and standing her ground. By the time they parted ways, a tentative understanding had formed between them. Henry promised to share more details about the company's situation, and Hannah offered to lend her perspective when needed. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. Grayson stood near the window in Henry's office, his arms crossed as he stared at the city skyline. The air between him and Henry was heavy with tension, a conversation that had started as a simple debrief spiraling into yet another disagreement. Grayson's jaw tightened as he turned to face Henry, his tone low but laced with frustration. "This is a mistake, Henry," Grayson said, his voice steady but insistent. "Hannah Hayes has no place in your business affairs. She was brought into your life for one reason, and one reason only, to fulfill the terms of the will. Nothing more." Henry leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he regarded Grayson with calm detachment. "And yet here we are," he said, his tone measured. "Her suggestion has merit. You can't deny that." "It's irrelevant whether it has merit," Grayson snapped, taking a step closer to the desk. "She isn't a consultant. She isn't part of your team. She's here because of a contract, not because she has any authority in this company." Henry's lips pressed into a thin line, a sign that his patience was wearing thin. "Authority doesn't matter if the idea works," he replied. "This isn't about roles or titles, Grayson. It's about saving this company. And if she can help me do that, I'd be a fool not to listen." Grayson shook his head, his frustration palpable. "You're letting her in too far. The arrangement is temporary. She's temporary. You can't build a foundation on something that's not going to last." Henry rose from his chair, his imposing height giving him an edge in the confrontation. "This is my company," he said firmly, his voice brooking no argument. "And I'll make the decisions I think are best for it. If her idea fails, it's on me. But I won't dismiss a potential solution because of some arbitrary boundary." Grayson's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more. He turned back to the window, his silence a reluctant concession. Despite Grayson's objections, Henry wasted no time in putting Hannah's suggestion to the test. It was a calculated risk, but one that felt necessary. The division in question had been hemorrhaging money for months, and every traditional solution they had tried had failed. Hannah's fresh perspective, identifying inefficiencies in the supply chain and suggesting renegotiations with key suppliers, offered a glimmer of hope. Henry tasked a small team with implementing her proposal on a trial basis, monitoring the results closely. At first, the team was skeptical, their doubts evident in the way they questioned every detail of the plan. But as the weeks passed, the results began to speak for themselves. Operational costs dropped significantly, and the division's performance stabilized for the first time in over a year. The changes were small but impactful, a ripple effect that began to restore confidence among the staff. Employees who had been disillusioned by months of turmoil started to feel a renewed sense of purpose, their morale lifting as the numbers improved. Henry watched the transformation with a mixture of relief and quiet satisfaction. He had taken a gamble, and it had paid off. But more than that, he found himself impressed by Hannah's insight. Her suggestion had been simple but effective, a reminder that sometimes the best solutions came from unexpected places. Grayson, however, remained unconvinced. "One successful experiment doesn't make her an expert," he said during one of their increasingly tense discussions. "Don't forget why she's here. She's a pawn, Henry. Nothing more." Henry ignored him, his focus shifting to the growing list of challenges that still needed addressing. Grayson's warnings felt increasingly irrelevant as he began to rely more on Hannah's perspective. Their conversations often extended beyond the office, spilling into the evenings during dinner. It had started unintentionally, Henry mentioning a business problem in passing, and Hannah offering a casual observation that turned out to be surprisingly insightful. Over time, these discussions became a regular occurrence, a rhythm that felt both natural and productive. One evening, as they sat across from each other in the dining room, Henry brought up another struggling division. "The domestic operations team is falling behind," he said, spearing a bite of salmon with his fork. "They're over budget, and their timelines are slipping. It's becoming a problem." Hannah set her wine glass down, her brow furrowing in thought. "Have you looked at their resource allocation?" she asked. "Sometimes delays happen because teams are stretched too thin or assigned to the wrong priorities. It might not be a lack of effort, it could be a lack of focus." Henry nodded slowly, considering her words. "That's a good point," he admitted. "I'll have the operations director take another look." These dinners, once awkward and perfunctory, had become moments of collaboration and connection. Henry found himself looking forward to them, not just for the insights Hannah offered but for the dynamic they had developed. She challenged him in ways few people dared to, pushing him to think differently and approach problems from new angles. For Hannah, the conversations were equally fulfilling. She had spent so long suppressing the part of herself that thrived on solving complex problems, focusing instead on the day-to-day grind of survival. Now, she felt a spark of the person she used to be, a woman capable of navigating challenges and making a difference. The more they worked together, the more Henry began to see Hannah not as an outsider but as an integral part of his world. She wasn't just fulfilling a role, she was contributing in ways that mattered. And while Grayson's disapproval loomed in the background, Henry found himself increasingly certain that involving her had been the right decision. One night, as they finished dinner, Henry leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You've made quite an impression," he said, his tone warm but serious. Hannah raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Is that a compliment?" "It is," he replied, his gaze steady. You've brought something to this company, and to my life, that I didn't realize was missing. For that, I'm grateful." The words hung in the air, their weight unmistakable. Hannah felt a flicker of emotion she couldn't quite name, but she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. The steady hum of activity filled the bustling headquarters of Carter Enterprises. Employees moved briskly through the halls, carrying documents and exchanging updates. Amid the corporate buzz, Hannah walked beside Henry, her once tentative presence now commanding quiet respect. She had become a regular fixture in the office, her ideas and insights breathing new life into the company's operations. As they entered the boardroom for a meeting with the senior management team, Hannah couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. What had started as a transactional arrangement had evolved into something more, a partnership that felt genuine and deeply rooted in mutual respect. The meeting began with a review of the company's latest quarterly performance. One of the directors presented a report detailing the successes of the venture where Henry had implemented Hannah's suggestions. The turnaround had exceeded expectations, drawing attention from investors and boosting morale across the organization. Henry turned to Hannah during the discussion, his expression thoughtful. "What's your take on the next steps?" he asked, his tone inviting her input. Hannah glanced at the charts projected on the screen, her mind racing with possibilities. "You've stabilized the immediate issues," she began, her voice confident. "Now it's time to focus on long-term growth. Diversify into emerging markets and invest in innovation. It's risky, but the potential returns are worth it." The room fell silent as the directors absorbed her suggestion. Then, one by one, they nodded in agreement. Henry's lips curved into a small smile, a look of pride flickering in his eyes. Outside the boardroom, Grayson watched the interaction with thinly veiled disapproval. He had tried repeatedly to remind Henry of the temporary nature of their arrangement, but his warning seemed to fall on deaf ears. Later that day, Grayson confronted Henry in his office. "You're losing sight of the bigger picture," he said bluntly. "She's leaving when the terms are fulfilled. You're setting yourself up for complications that you can't afford." Henry leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but firm. "I'm fully aware of the arrangement, Grayson. But while she's here, she's making a difference. That's all that matters." Grayson shook his head, exasperation etched on his face. "You're fooling yourself if you think this won't end badly." Despite Grayson's words, Henry couldn't deny the truth that had been building in the back of his mind. Over the months, his feelings for Hannah had shifted. What began as a calculated business decision had grown into something he hadn't anticipated. Hannah, too, found herself grappling with emotions she couldn't easily define. The more time she spent working alongside Henry, the more she saw beneath his polished exterior. He was still guarded, but she glimpsed moments of vulnerability that made her question the assumptions she had made about him. The day the inheritance was officially secured marked a turning point. The funds stabilized the company, allowing Henry to breathe a sigh of relief for the first time in months. There was no grand celebration, just a quiet acknowledgement of the milestone. That evening, Henry and Hannah sat in the study, sipping glasses of wine as they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. "We did it," Henry said softly, raising his glass in a quiet toast. Hannah smiled, clinking her glass against his. "You did it," she corrected. "I just helped a little." "You did more than a little," he replied, his voice sincere. "I couldn't have done this without you." The moment lingered, the air between them charged with unspoken words. But before either could say anything more, the sound of Ethan's laughter echoed down the hall, breaking the spell. As they left the study to join Ethan in the living room, Hannah felt a pang of bittersweet emotion. The terms of their arrangement had been fulfilled, and soon it would be time to leave. But as she watched Henry playfully chase Ethan around the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that her heart had become entangled in ways she hadn't anticipated. The fireplace crackled softly, its warmth filling the room as Hannah and Henry sat across from each other in the study. A stack of neatly prepared documents rested on the low table between them, an unspoken reminder of the conversation they could no longer avoid. Hannah's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the papers. Henry, seated opposite her, appeared equally unsettled, his usual composure replaced by a quiet tension. "So," Hannah began, breaking the silence. "What happens now?" Henry hesitated, his gaze dropping to the contract. "We finalize everything," he said slowly. "It's all straightforward," he began, his voice low and measured. "The payment will be transferred to your account within the week. The trust fund for Ethan is fully established, and the terms have been met." Hannah nodded but said nothing. She traced the edge of her sleeve with her fingers, her mind a swirl of emotions she didn't know how to articulate. This was the conclusion they had both expected, a business arrangement reaching its logical end. Yet the thought of leaving felt heavier than she had imagined. She nodded again, trying to keep her emotions in check. "And then I leave." "Yes," he said softly, though the words seemed to weigh heavily in the air. "Your flight details," Henry continued, clearing his throat, "will be finalized tomorrow. If you prefer a different destination, we can adjust." "I'm sure it's fine," Hannah interrupted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She finally glanced up, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment before darting away. The silence that followed was unbearable. "I suppose this is goodbye," she added after a long pause, her words hesitant and tinged with sadness. Henry's jaw tightened, and he looked down at the table. "I suppose it is," he echoed, though the words felt foreign in his mouth. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their shared experiences, the late-night discussions, the quiet dinners, the moments of unspoken understanding, hung heavily in the room. Suddenly, Henry pushed back his chair and stood. He ran a hand through his hair, his expression conflicted. "I need some time," he muttered, turning abruptly and leaving the room before Hannah could respond. She stared after him, her heart pounding. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that followed was deafening. Hours passed, and the house seemed unnaturally quiet. Hannah tried to distract herself, pacing her room and tidying her bed, but her thoughts kept circling back to their unfinished conversation. She told herself that this was for the best, that their arrangement had always been temporary. But the ache in her chest refused to subside. A soft knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find Henry standing there, his tie loosened and his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He entered the room but didn't sit, instead pacing restlessly. "I've been thinking," he began, his words slow and deliberate. "About everything, the arrangement, the company, Ethan, you." He stopped and turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. "And I realized something." Hannah held her breath, unsure of where he was going. "This isn't how I want it to end," he said, his voice firm but tinged with emotion. "You become more than just a part of the arrangement, Hannah. You become someone I trust. Someone I rely on." Her heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. "What are you saying, Henry?" she asked cautiously. "I'm saying I don't want you to leave," he replied. "Not yet, anyway. Stay on at the company. Take a permanent role. You've proven yourself to be an asset, and I'd be a fool to let you go." Hannah blinked, surprised by the offer. She had hoped for something more personal, more vulnerable, but his words were still unexpected. "You want me to work for you?" she asked, her tone a mix of incredulity and amusement. "Yes," he said quickly. "But it's not just about the company. It's about you, and how much you've contributed to this world I've built. You've made it better." She hesitated, the logical part of her mind urging her to accept. "I'll consider it," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. Henry nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "That's all I can ask." A few days later, they sat together in the garden, the crisp air carrying the scent of blooming flowers. Ethan played in the distance, his laughter drifting toward them as he chased butterflies. Henry broke the silence first. "I've been meaning to ask about your living arrangements," he began, his tone careful. "If you take the role, we'll need to figure out what works best for you and Ethan." Hannah tilted her head, studying him. "What do you think would work best?" she asked, a hint of curiosity in her voice. He hesitated, his hands resting on his knees. "Honestly, I'd like you to stay here. Not just for convenience, but because," he paused, gathering his thoughts. "Because I don't want you to leave at all." Her breath caught, and she turned to face him fully. "Henry," he looked at her, his expression raw and unguarded. "This started as a business arrangement, but it's become so much more. You and Ethan, you become a part of my life, and I can't imagine it without you." Tears pricked the corners of her eyes as she searched his face. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying I care about you," he interrupted gently. "I care about both of you. And I don't want to lose what we've built together." For a moment, she was too overwhelmed to respond. The walls she had built around her heart began to crumble, and she allowed herself to feel the emotions she had been suppressing for so long. "I care about you too," she admitted softly, her voice trembling. Henry reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Then stay. Stay with me. Let's build a life together, not because of a contract, but because we want to." A tear slipped down her cheek as she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. He smiled, a look of pure relief washing over his face. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was tentative at first, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared feelings, but it deepened quickly, a promise of the future they would create together. Months later, the mansion had transformed from a cold, imposing structure into a true home. Ethan had taken to calling Henry Dad without prompting, a change that brought tears to Hannah's eyes the first time she heard it. One quiet evening, the three of them sat on the couch, a movie playing in the background as Ethan dozed off between them. Henry reached for Hannah's hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Thank you," he said softly, his gaze full of gratitude. "For what?" she asked, smiling. "For giving us a chance," he replied. As she rested her head on his shoulder, Hannah felt a peace she hadn't known in years. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were a family.